I had a lot of time to drive this week, and I was just kind of letting my mind wander around, as sometimes we do, and I was challenging myself. I asked myself, if I had to describe the message of the Bible to someone in, say, a paragraph, what would I say? I kind of talked to myself like a weird guy driving up the road, and then I made it harder. What if I just had a couple sentences? What if I just had one sentence? What if I just had one phrase to describe the message of the Bible? I went all the way down to one word, and I didn't know what that one word would be other than God. If I just had one word to describe what the Bible is about, I would just say God. But if you gave me two words, I would say God saves is the message of the Bible. We talked a little bit about that last week, but this is the message of the Bible, that God saves, and that message begins here in Exodus. We're going to be this morning in Exodus 2 and in verse 11. And as you turn there, let me open up things a little bit for us. One of the most fundamental questions in all of life is a simple one. It's the question, who am I? And I don't mean like what my name is, but I mean like what is it that really makes me, me? What is the reason, if any, for my existence? What is my purpose? Where am I going? Where do I fit in? Where do I belong? What is my identity? I think when I was young, patriotism was very high. So maybe many people would say, first and foremost, if you asked them about themselves, they would say, I'm an American. And certainly that was true after 9/11. I think of all kinds of different things. My family and I, as you probably know, have kind of roots down in Kentucky. And that's a big point of pride for us. We find something of our identity in that part of our heritage. It could be your job or your education or your family or anything. Every person asks in one form or another, who am I? Where do I belong? What is my purpose? And as I said, we often answer that question with work or family or nationality or our accomplishments or maybe even our failures. The question of identity is one that our world is struggling with, of course, today. It's one that they've always struggled with. We're struggling with it so much today that we've become so dissatisfied with the categories of identity that we just start making up new ones. Just nonsensical stuff. It's something that we have always struggled with, and Moses is struggling with identity in this passage today. Maybe you would, if you were honest with yourself, you would say you're here this morning and you feel like this is kind of the question that you have. This is kind of what's weighing on your heart. Maybe you haven't, spoken it out in so many words, but maybe you're thinking to yourself, I don't really know who I am. I don't really know where I belong or what my purpose is or where I fit. Maybe God has something in this story this morning for you. Last week, as we began Exodus, right there in the beginning of chapter 1, we found that God begins his work of rescue in quiet and hidden ways, under the surface, before anyone even knows that rescue is needed. In the story, there have been no miracles yet. And I say that, I guess, with a little bit of hesitation, because if I was honest with myself, I think everything that's happened in the story so far is a miracle in some sense. But there's been no overwhelming, overt, in-your-face miracles that everyone sees. There's been no dramatic and divine intervention yet in the Exodus story. At least, again, not that anyone can see. God has clearly been at work. We've been talking about that. And we ended last week with this reminder after chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2 that God is at work even when we cannot see it. And if that was the encouragement from the scripture last week, then the next question that we have to ask is, okay, when do we get to see it? If God is always at work, if he's always under the surface, if he's always working for us and just behind the scenes, that sounds wonderful. But when do we actually get to see that work? When does that hidden work become visible? That's what we're going to talk about a little bit this morning in Exodus 2:11. Sorry for the lengthy introduction, but let's go ahead and read it together today. Exodus 2, beginning in verse 11. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day, he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, why have you returned so early today? And they answered, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. And where is he? Reuel asked his daughters. Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat. Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Let's pray before we examine what's going on here. Father, we love you. We thank you for your word. We thank you for this story of Exodus. It's so powerful and so transformative. Help it to transform our lives, God, and help it to point us to the one who really can transform our lives. Help it to show us more and more of Jesus. That's what we're asking, Father. Help us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so in verse 11, we pick up where we left off. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were, and he watched them at their hard labor. This first little sentence gives us so much information. There's so much jammed in here. Moses' life from his infancy, when he was found by the Pharaoh's daughter in that river, to now his adulthood is left out of the story. We don't need that information. We know from the passage that he is still in this place of privilege. He's still in the palace or something like it of the Pharaoh. He wasn't with his people. And he went out from this place of plenty and all that he needed. And it says he looked upon his people. His people. So we know that he was over here. His people were over there. He was separated from them. And we see too that Moses knew fully that he was a Hebrew. He had been now in the Pharaoh's household for 40 years. But something in him still hadn't forgotten who he actually was. I wondered, did Moses, as he grew up, was his skin tone just a little bit different? Were his facial features a little bit different? Did he get teased a lot growing up? I wonder. I bet he did. Moses had grown up now. And just a little bit of historical background for you. We talked last week about how the Bible isn't interested to name this Pharaoh. It names the little people. The Bible, God writes his story through little people. We don't know the name of this Pharaoh, but the best guess is it's a Pharaoh called Ramses the Great. You probably have heard that name before. Ramses the Great was one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful Pharaoh in all of Egyptian history. Now, there's been some stir on the news lately with the president and some kind of a statue or something like that. I don't know. I can't keep up with all that craziness. But Ramses, he commissioned over 1,000 statues that were life-size or bigger of him to be scattered all over the Egyptian empire. This is the quintessential Egyptian pharaoh look because this was the most powerful. He spread his image everywhere, but the Bible doesn't care to recognize him. I mean, he looks powerful, doesn't he? Regal, majestic. Who in all the world could compare? And if this is the person, that forced the Israelites into slavery, it would make sense. Because he was so powerful. Because this is a Pharaoh that reigned for an exceptionally long time. Because this Pharaoh, more than anything, was known for his building campaigns. And what the Bible told us last week, that the Pharaoh who enslaved the Egyptians forced them to build entire cities for him. You can see how big just this one monument he built to himself is. That's some guy's head down there. It's crazy. Crazy. This is the best guess. Ramses the Great. Second best guess is his son named Merneptah. You're all familiar with that, right? Merneptah. Merneptah is the son of Ramses the Great. This is called the Merneptah stele. I don't know if you've heard of it before. This is the actual size of it. This was found in ancient Egypt. And the only reason I'm sharing this with you is this tablet contains the first archaeological evidence of the people of God, Israelites. It refers specifically to them. So the second best guess, it's the guy who created this, Merneptah. First best guess, Ramses the Great. And part of the challenge is that Ramses the Great had Merneptah as a son. Merneptah was one of 100 children. And this is the point. This is not just fun pictures and show and tell. This is the point. Merneptah was one of Ramses' 100 children. It wasn't unusual at all for a pharaoh to have dozens and dozens of wives. And I just tell you that so you can frame the story in your mind in the right place. Moses is not in this story like Joseph had been essentially the prime minister of Egypt before that. Moses is a grandchild of the Pharaoh by adoption. And he's a grandchild because he's the son of one of the 100 of children. Does that make sense? I don't know how to say it in a clearer way, but I think you understand what I mean. All that to say, Moses didn't really know where he fit. I think this is part of what's leading Moses to struggle with identity, because in Egypt, he's not really too high, he's not really too low, he's not really an Egyptian, but in a way he kind of is. He's not really a Hebrew, but in a way he's more Hebrew than anything else in the world. Where does he fit? Moses grew up in the household of one of the most powerful rulers that the world has ever known. He's had an education like no other. He's had wealth and privilege that he couldn't have imagined, but he still didn't know who he truly was. He didn't know where he fit. Moses was probably around 40 here because of the context clues in the rest of the Bible. He'd had 40 years of this privilege. He'd had 40 years of training and education, the finest schools and preparation, and now, for whatever reason, Moses steps out of the palace and he goes to see his people. We're not told why. He just goes out, and what he sees is oppression. What he sees there is injustice. What he sees is the suffering of this group of people, and maybe that's when it finally hits him. That could have been me. It could have been me. It should be me. There's an English reformer in the 1500s who once was watching men walk to the gallows to be hanged for their crimes. And he said a famous phrase. He said, "There, but for the grace of God go I." Have you heard that before? Have you ever, not out of any kind of condemnation, not out of any kind of judgment, but have you ever seen someone else who was struggling or who was just at rock bottom, and you say to yourself, but for the grace of God? That's where I would be too. Has that ever happened to you? Has it ever ran across your mind? I hope it does every once in a while, because I hope then you go and tell them about Jesus, because he can rescue them just like he rescued you. But I wonder if this is part of what's going through Moses' mind here. I could just as easily be there with all my people. I should be there. Why am I here? How am I not being abused and all of my people are? He awakened. Whatever it was in Moses that changed in this moment, we don't really know. But he did change. Have you had those moments in your life? And I'm not talking about seasons or like big events. I'm talking about like moments in your life that change everything for you. Maybe it's falling in love. Maybe it's that diagnosis. Maybe it's becoming a parent. Maybe it's finally realizing what you think God wants you to do with your life. Maybe it's the loss of a loved one, or achieving a personal dream, or really finally hitting rock bottom. Whatever it is, there are moments in our lives, individual moments, that change the rest of the trajectory of our lives completely. Have you heard about how Pastor Rob came to Northside? Pastor Rob was a full-time pastor elsewhere, several hours away, and he and his family were kind of up here part-time, and kids were going to school, and he'll tell you, if you ask him, how did you end up here? He and his family, I think, were just bored in the middle of the week, called around to see if any churches had going on, and he'll tell you, he's here because we answered the phone. That's what led him and all his family. It's just a moment, wasn't it? That changed a lot of lives. And hopefully there are a lot more lives to be changed, but this is the point. Now we know it's not just a phone call. We know God's at work under all of that. I don't know how Moses was going to describe this or would describe it if he had to, but this moment changed his life forever. And I think it has to do with identity. Moses is asking these questions of identity, and he finally gets out and he finds the truest aspect of his identity in these people, God's people, but they're being abused, they're being mistreated. And something rises in Moses in verse 12. Read that one more time, 12:2. It says this, looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, isn't that how sin works? Isn't that how sin works? We look for witnesses before, and we try to cover our tracks after. Isn't that how sin works? I think very rarely do we fall into sin thoughtlessly. Sometimes we do. But if you're anything like me, it's not something I accidentally do. It's something that I choose to do. I think it's something you choose to do too. And you look around, don't you, this way and that before you do it, and then you do it, and then you try to cover up your tracks. You try to clean up the mess. I don't know what sin it is you struggle with. But I bet it follows that pattern. I bet it follows that model. I need to come clean with you for a moment about something that's going on in our family. I really do. I'm going to be vulnerable for a moment. I don't want to call it an addiction, but it's getting close. I'm talking about ice cream. What? Ice cream. We love ice cream. If we've gotten to the end of a week and we haven't had ice cream as a family about 3 times, something's wrong. It's one of the best parts of life. There's so many. I'm getting more head nods right now than I've ever gotten since I started here. You guys like ice cream too, right? We love it. And half the fun for us is just, at the end of a long day, school's over, work's all done, we got a little bowl of ice cream and we sit down and watch reruns of Home Improvement or something, don't we? That's half the fun. That's half the fun. The other half is that ice cream is delicious. That's the other. And here's the problem with me. Once every, 6 months or so, not a lot, but every 6 months or so, I realize and remember in the middle of the afternoon how delicious ice cream is. And if you're a normal person, you're thinking, we don't care. We don't care if you get ice cream sometimes in the afternoon. I know you don't care. It would be weird if you did, but you know who does care? Naomi. She cares. More than once I have been caught because we share our location with each other, right? Getting ice cream without your spouse is pretty much like Christian cheating, I think. The first time I got caught, it was my fault. Let me show you this picture real quick. I've had this ring for 20 years, right? And it broke, and I was so sad. And I sent Naomi this picture, and I just wanted her to grieve with me a little bit. My cross ring broke. I got it fixed now. But I sent her this picture. I got in trouble immediately because Naomi could tell just from the way the table looked that I was at the ice cream place. We got a problem as a family. And every 6 months or so, when I get that hankering, I'm playing with fire because Naomi is keeping tabs on me. I promise you, it's crazy. But the thing is, I can look this way and that way, but the satellites got me, right? Stinking technology. Some people are worried about AI these days. I'm still worried about GPS. This is real. This is real life. I'm saying all this, it's silly, I know, but this is what the Bible's talking about. When I get ice cream, I look this way and that, but the satellites are still going to get me. Moses, when he was about to sin, he looked this way and he looked that way, but he didn't look in the right way. Do you understand? You may keep your sin hidden for a time from people around you, but you never keep it hidden from God. Ever. I know the only thing you're going to remember from this morning is the story about ice cream, and I pray that you don't. Jot down a couple other little notes, but this is what's going on. Moses is angry, and he has every right to be angry. It's a terrible thing that is going on, but then what Moses does is terrible. What Moses does is he tries to fix this problem. He tries to do what he feels like is the godly thing, but he does it in the most ungodly way possible. He tries to accomplish God's purposes through human means and through human effort and power and inhuman timing. Moses saw a problem and he got straight to work. The very next day, right, he killed the Hebrew and buried him, and it's all good. I wonder if he went to bed easy that night and just thought, man, I've really accomplished something. I wonder if he went to bed that night and he felt like maybe he'd finally found who he was. He was a Hebrew and he was going to be this rescuer, this protector of the Hebrew people. And so when he gets up the next morning, he goes out and it seems like he's just going to keep working. Keep cleaning up the streets. He sees these guys fighting. Moses is like the first Batman. No, Moses. I don't know what's going on. I'm just tired, okay? But listen, he goes out and he tries to intervene and stop this fight. And what happens? He's rejected immediately. Who made you ruler and judge over us? And that question's an important one. It's a profound one because the answer is no one. No one yet. Moses had assumed a role that God had not yet given him. Moses had sensed this calling. He'd gotten a little twinge of this purpose in his life, and then he'd immediately taken things into his own hands and done them in his own way, by his own power. And what was the result? Messed up everything. Everything has gone wrong. He's exposed. He's in fear. He's failed. He's sinned. Someone has seen what Moses had done. We never hear about the guy that Moses saved. I wonder if it was just a guy who's like, Moses just killed this guy. I don't know who saw Moses, but someone saw him. The Pharaoh hears about it. And now Moses, the one who was preserved from death, is once again under this sentence of death, and he runs out into the wilderness. He runs from power into obscurity. He runs from wealth into poverty. He runs from Egypt into Midian, from the center of the known world to its edge. Because although Moses had found an identity, or part of it, although he'd sensed some little bit of calling, although he'd developed some little feeling of purpose, he tried to do things in his own way. Last week, one of the things that we learned was that God's purposes cannot be undone. Even by the Pharaoh himself, God's purposes cannot be undone. But Moses learns a different kind of lesson this week. Here's key point number 1. God's purposes cannot be forced. God's purposes cannot be forced. Moses learns first thing that God's work must happen in God's way. I wonder, are you struggling with anything because you're striving too hard to get the good things of God done in your own time? Last week we learned that no one against him can slow him down. No one who is against God can slow him down, but what do we often do? Well, we're for God. We love God. We try to speed him up, don't we? Those who are against God can't slow him down. Those who are for him cannot speed him up, although we always want to. Let's go on again into verse 16. Not too much more. If you've heard of this place called Midian, I would suggest that you've heard about it because of the Bible. Probably not because, well, like Egypt, it's world famous even to this day. Midian is not like that. Midian is small, it's out of the way, it's unremarkable, and Moses arrives there with no title, with nothing. He steps into this place and he doesn't have any power, he doesn't have any influence, he's just a fugitive. And he's just sitting by this well at some point. There's a lot of amazing things that God does by wells. You saw a group of girls there. They were just trying to do what they did probably every day and come and get water for their livestock. And a group of shepherds up to no good forced them out and maybe was violent toward them or who knows. Anyway, Moses steps in. And Moses stands between these enemies and these kind of innocent people who didn't really do anything to deserve the way they were being treated. It's the same kind of heart that we saw with his people back in Egypt. But this time something's different. This time we're not told about any violence, no sin. Something is different. Moses is changing. He's welcomed into this new household. He marries this girl named Zipporah. And I always thought that was funny, but he's in Midian for 40 years. So it's not like day one, all this happens, gets married. Like this is 40 years condensed all down into these few verses. Verse 22 again, though, listen to this. Moses begins a new life, and it says, Zipporah gave birth to a son. And then Moses named his son Gershom, saying, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. That struggle of identity for Moses is still there, isn't it? It's still there. You can see it in what he's naming his son. The struggle is still there. He's caught between identities. He was born a Hebrew, but he was raised as an Egyptian. He was thought of as an outsider by Egyptians. He was thought of as an outsider by his own people. He was rejected by his own people. And now these people in this place called Midian, they think he's an Egyptian, and they're calling him an Egyptian. He's living now in this strange land, separated from everything. Moses belongs nowhere until God defines who he is. He didn't belong fully in Egypt. Now he doesn't fully belong in Midian. He's in between. He's not who he once was. He's not yet who he will be. And this is the easy thing to miss. This is one of the big points we're going to nail before we close today, is that none of that time is wasted. None of Moses' 40 years in relative obscurity in Midian is wasted. 40 years he spent there. Not leading, not delivering, not rescuing, just waiting, just shepherding, just leading an ordinary life. If we let ourselves, we'd think, well, the story is just kind of stalled. But the Bible won't let us stay there, because this is how God works. He prepares us in the places that we would never choose for ourselves. Midian for Moses is not a detour, it's a time of formation. The man who once acted so impulsively has now been shaped into someone who is more level-headed, who will one day soon walk patiently with God and walk steadily as he leads others. The Egyptian palace might have given him an education like no other, but his time in the wilderness gave him his time in the wilderness gave him the wisdom that he would need to do what God was about to have him to do. God is still at work all throughout. Here's key point number 2, getting closer to the end. God's servants are often formed in hidden places. God's servants are often formed in hidden places. I've been sticking up these cross references and stuff for you. There are so many places in the Bible you could go to see how God prepares his people out of the spotlight before he brings them in. It's good stuff. Okay, meanwhile, back in Egypt, verse 23, getting close. During that long period when Moses is in Midian, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. Their cry went up to God. The suffering in Egypt hasn't stopped. Time has passed, but nothing has changed. And God begins to feel absent. If you haven't picked up on it in the story, it's as clear now as it could ever be that God is active. He has been watching. He has been involved. Verse 24, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. You see 4 verbs from God there. What are they? He heard, he remembered, he looked, and he was concerned. Well, those are all pretty straightforward. The only thing I would say is we have to be careful that when we read that word remembered, it's not as though God had ever forgotten anything. It's just simply the way to say that God had made these promises, and now he was beginning to work to make good on those promises. Everything is moving forward. Everything we saw in chapter 1 led us to chapter 2. Everything in chapter 2 is going to lead us on into chapter 3. It's not random. Everything has been building now to this moment at the end of our passage this morning, where God begins to move. God begins to stir. You get just the first little glimpse of the sunrise coming over the horizon. Key point number 3 is this: God's promises guarantee God's rescue. God promised in Genesis that he would take care of his people, and his promises guarantee that they're going to be rescued from this situation. God's promises to Abraham guaranteed rescue in Egypt. God's promises through Christ guarantee rescue for you. Did you know that? What God has promised through Jesus means that your rescue, if you've trusted him, is certain. It's sure. You will be rescued no matter what it is you're going through. God is at work all along. He sees. God hears. He hasn't forgotten. God is about to act on the behalf of his people. And next week, as we pick up where we left off, we're going to see that God speaks in the story for the first time. Here, this story, I think, meets us where we are. It meets us in a very real place, because there are moments in our lives when we feel as though we know what God has promised. We know that he can do it, but when we look out and kind of survey the landscape, it just feels like everything is not going anywhere. Everything is stalled. What's going on? And either we try to force things forward like Moses did, or we just sit back and get sad that nothing is happening and maybe God's not working. But Exodus 2 tells us that both of those are misunderstandings, because God's rescue is not dependent on your striving. And his purposes are not delayed by what happens in your life. God was working when Moses acted too soon. God was working when Moses sat in the wilderness. God was working when Israel was still groaning, and the same is true now. Here are just a couple questions I want you to sit with maybe this week and think about. Where in your life are you trying to force God's hand? Where are you trying to force something to happen that only God can fulfill? Think about that this week. And where have you assumed that God is absent, but you've assumed that simply because he's quiet? Think about that this week, because the truth is that God often does his deepest work, his most important work, in the seasons of our lives that feel the slowest. Does your life feel slow now? Some of you are trying to force what only he can accomplish, but you can't do it. We have to trust in the God who hears. We have to trust in the God who sees and remembers and knows, and at just the right time, he acts. That's the God we have to trust. So this week, instead of trying to force it, trust him. This week, instead of thinking that if he's quiet, he's absent, then just pause and listen and think it through. The most important question for everyone in the room this morning to settle is simple. Where is your true identity found? When someone comes up and says, "Tell me about yourself," what is the first thing out of your mouth? If it has anything other than to do with Jesus, something's a little off. If you don't find your identity in the one who created you, and the one who came down to save you, and the one who wants to spend eternity with you, if you don't find your deepest identity in him, I'm going to ask you to come forward in just a minute as we sing, and we can pray and change that. Closing challenge is simple. Find your identity in the God who is concerned with you. And remember, you can't slow him down. You can't speed him up. Just trust him. He's got you.